So, I am Nick Pouder, and I'm here this morning with my father, George Pouder, who just moved to New Milford and is living with us. And we're going to be talking a bit about his experiences in World War II and in the early and mid part of the 20th century. So, I'd like to introduce George Pouder. Dad, why don't you tell them a little bit about who you are and where you grew up? And
Well, I'm a Depression kid, and we had very little, and America was a very different place in those days. And in fact, I never had a bedroom of my own until shortly before December 7th, 1941, which everyone knows was Pearl Harbor Day. And on Pearl Harbor Day, unquote, I was varnishing furniture to go in what would be for the first time my own bedroom. And my father called up to me and said that there was a radio announcement that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. I didn't even know where Pearl Harbor was, but the news broadcast quickly made it clear that they had damaged greatly damaged the Pacific Fleet and many casualties besides, and we would no doubt be in a war the next day. And Roosevelt made a speech that day about the day that will live in infamy, and we were at war with Japan and Germany uh, right away.
you were a college student at the time, right? You had just started your first semester as a college student?
Yeah, I was a college student at Farmingdale, and I was home that weekend, and then I went back the next on Sunday night, and the train was filled with people who were saying they were going to enlist in the morning, and many of them did, and classrooms emptied suddenly, and the college went on an accelerated program to get us educated before the Army grabbed us. And rationing began in the United States immediately, and you could only get one pair of shoes a year, or one set of automobile tires a year. Gasoline for cars was rationed, and I don't remember because we didn't have a car. We couldn't afford a car. We never had a car. And America went on a war footing, and you'd be surprised they wanted you to save your toothpaste tubes because they were made of aluminum at the time. And the whole country went on a war footing. The trains back to Long Island, you had to draw the shades down on the eastern side of the train because Nazi submarines immediately were prowling along the east coast of the United States and torpedoing ships a few miles off of Asbury Park. And so it was a difficult time. The rations, you weren't allowed much meat or butter. Those things were all rationed. The only meat that was not rationed was chicken. Everything else, you were entitled to so many ounces of meat, and you had to give a coupon when you bought your meat, and they made sure that you were not getting anything beyond what they had programmed you for. The country also was at war with, as I said, with Nazi Germany, because the Germans had a treaty with Japan that they would fight mutually. They would fight together if one were involved in a war, and so many Germans had a Bund, as they called it. It was fraternal organization like the Masons, and they had camps where they cultivated the new Nazi regime in Germany. And they were, of course, they were all closed when we went to war with Germany.
Before the war, there was actually a fair amount of Nazi movement in the United States, as I
Yes,
understand. And
that's-
your mother or your grandmother was actually German and had
Yeah.
come to the United States, 20 or
Well,
30 years
my
before?
grandmother was German, and I remember coming home from school every day, and Hitler would make these speeches, and my grandmother listened to the speeches. I can see her at the kitchen table, and every time Hitler said something, she screamed curses at him and banged on the table, called him a Dummkopf and other names that I thought were innocuous, but later, when I learned a little German, I realized that she was insulting him constantly and had no use for him. But it indicated that not all Germans were Nazis, including the Germans in the United States who had left and had come in as refugees from the Nazi persecution in the early Hitler days.
And when did that sentiment change? When did the Nazi sympathizers start to lose clout and power? And
Well, when the war started, they couldn't do it. They would be arrested, and so they were under control. And
right.
they also, some German Americans were interned, as they did with the Japanese and also with Italians, because Italy was in the alliance with Germany and Japan too.
After the Japanese attacked and you went back to college, what happened then? You said the number of students just immediately enlisted.
The classrooms cleaned out rapidly, and the school decided to accelerate the course so we could finish semesters and so on. In my case, to graduate, and so.
So didn't they came and recruited from the school, right? The Army came and recruited and did that.
Well, no, and we did not have an ROTC, and so some students started drilling, and one of the faculty members had been in the First World War, and he offered to teach them how to drill, and they drilled with broomsticks on the tennis court. And I never could see what help drilling would do me anyway, even when I was in the Army. And so I did not join in on that. But I volunteered in 1942. I volunteered, and I was called up in 1943, and most of 1943 and part of 1944, I was stationed in Fort Belvoir, Virginia, which was an engineer training camp. And from Belvoir, I was sent to Newport News, Virginia, to be shipped out to God knows where and get involved in the war. And I was supposed to ship out on the 1st of April, 44. And I came down with pneumonia and was hospitalized in March. And one day I was called into the doctor's office at the camp hospital. And he examined me, and he said as seemingly to talking to himself, we're not releasing you today. And I thought, why did he say that? And I found that when you were due to be shipped, the doctors had the right to cancel any Army orders if they thought the health of the soldier was imperiled by releasing him. Well, it was more imperiled than either of us knew, because that ship was torpedoed with the loss of the entire crew and the entire 504 soldiers on it. It was sunken in the Mediterranean. It was sunk in the Mediterranean, and I was put on the following shipment, which would be another week after that, and I found we were 3 weeks at sea in a troop ship, which is quite an ordeal. Anyway, we got to Africa, and we were sent to a camp in Africa called Lion Mountain, and it was a replacement depot, and the Army slang for that was Repel Depot. But the Repel Depot was on a mountaintop in a nature preserve, and it was called Lion Mountain because the last African lions had been found in that camp 40 years before, and the lions were the predator for hyenas and jackals. And so they told us when we had guard duty in the middle of the night, if we thought we heard babies crying in the woods, it was the hyenas crying, and that was true. In addition to the hyenas, we had a cobra in our tent under the bed next to mine that came out one day and stood up and flared its cheeks at us and chased us around the tent till somebody killed it with a rifle butt, I think it was.
So you had a lot of close calls there. I mean, you were very fortunate to miss that first convoy, and then you had the Cobra, and then after that you.
Well, wait, I'm not finished with the menagerie yet, because we had storks too. The storks lived in the trees in Africa in the winter months, and then flew across the Mediterranean 5,000 miles to Denmark, and then they perched on roofs in Denmark for the summer when it was cooler than Africa, and then flew back another 5,000 miles to Africa. It was an amazing story of the migration. It still goes on.
And then you actually, after serving in North Africa, you were slowly moved up as part of the wave of the assault through the south of France, right?
Yeah, but first I was sent to Corsica, and Corsica at that time could be called an aircraft carrier, because it was a launching pad for all the air raids that were made on Italy and occupied France. And we had a gasoline pipeline that served, I believe it was 6 airports, all on the eastern side of Corsica. And I spent the summer of 44, I guess it was 44 there. And in September, we were involved in the invasion of southern France. There was very little resistance in the invasion, and we landed without incident. And I had a very interesting experience in a place called Antibes, where we were setting up another gasoline pipeline and gasoline tanks because we had set up a PT boat base there that we would provide the pipelines and the gasoline to supply the PT boats. And while I was there, we were trying to attach a gasoline hose from the gasoline tanker ship to some antiquated French plumbing that came between our line and the existing French line. And they needed two adapters that would combine the two pipes. And the captain asked me if I could speak French. Well, I had the correspondence course from the Army French correspondence course in French. But I said yes anyway, and he said, well, your job now is to walk into town, find a plumbing shop, and get us another one of these pots. It was a small pot, you could hold it in your hand. So I walked into town, and I thought, this is a posh resort. There certainly are no plumbing shops in Antibes. But lo and behold, there was a plumbing shop right in front of me. And I walked in, and I tried my French on him. Nous avons besoin d'un pipe comme ça. I'm sure it was very horrible French, but he understood. And furthermore, he answered in English. And he told me, yes, he did have the parts. And I thought, oh, great, I ingratiate myself now with my captain. And who knows how profitable this trip will be. But he said he wanted to shake my hand because I was the first American he had seen, because the town had just been liberated. And in fact, it was so recently liberated that the telephone poles had posters of the most wanted French underground fighters.
The resistance fighters, the French
resistance fighters, and that would be I don't know how many francs for the reward. One of them looked suspiciously like the guy in the plumbing shop, which happened to be the truth. And so that he invited me to dinner that night to meet his wife and family, because he wanted me to meet his wife and family. And so I went, and I thought, what can I bring? I have to bring something to my host and hostess. And so I didn't smoke, and I got a carton of cigarettes as a ration every week, and so I brought the cigarettes. And his wife was a graduate of the Sorbonne, and they had a daughter who was 11 years old, and she was quite a prodigy. She spoke perfect English at 11. It was British English, British accented English, and later became a professor who was teaching Byzantine history in the University of Nanterre, and was an author, and you can find her in Google. Her name was Evelyn Patlagian. It's Patlagean. And as we talked at dinner, I discovered that they were refugees from Paris, and supposedly had gotten on the last train out of Paris, and gotten down to Marseille and then worked over to Antibes. They were Jewish, and Evelyn was hidden in a convent in Antibes for 2 or 3 years by the nuns. And that's where she learned her English from the English language study there. John was actually owned a company that fabricated silk, and he designed on silk. So he had a luxury trade in Paris. They had a nice townhouse in Paris. Both were confiscated by the Nazis. A Nazi sympathizer was given the apartment, and I don't know what happened with the silk factory, but they eventually got back. But for the present time, I wrote home that I had been befriended by this French family, and they had a real food problem, and I was invited back every night. They wanted me to come back every night that I was there. And when I came back, I would bring our infamous sea rations. But his wife Dina had doctored them up so beautifully with Provençal herbs that I didn't know myself what we were eating, and they thought it was great. But my mother, when I wrote home and told my mother, and she was rationed too in the United States, but she made it her business to prepare boxes of food that she could send to help them. And so she would include things with a growing child, especially. She would include things like vitamins and gelatins and canned meats and sugar and flour so that they could do some cooking. And when I came back years later with Evelyn and took her to meet my mother, they hugged each other and were crying, and my mother was so pleased to hear how much it had helped them. And I corresponded with Evelyn for 50 years until her death.
And I actually had a chance to meet her as well in Paris about 20 years ago.
When we
which
were
was
in
great.
Paris as tourists, we had a chance to meet her. My wife still complains because when we landed in the hotel in Paris, I said to my wife, now I want to show you my Paris. And we went out and walked and walked and walked and came back to the hotel, and the clerk, as we got our key, the clerk said, you have a phone call. And it was Evelyn, and we were supposed to have dinner with them that night, and your mother was ready to collapse, and we took a cab and we went to their house, and they had prepared me this wonderful meal, and it was just a very moving experience to have helped save these people, and that they were such good friends and appreciative.
Following your time in the south of France, you then began the assault on Germany and moved up through France into Germany. And you were, at that time, you were with the 42nd Infantry. Can you talk a little bit about your experience at the Dachau concentration camp?
Yeah. Well, we were coming down out of Nuremberg, and I looked at the map, and I knew we were heading to capture Munich, but I looked at the map and I thought, the only natural obstacle in the way is the Danube River. And after that, it should be easy. So, because the Germans were, for the most part, surrendering and pulling back, and little resistance. Not always. Sometimes there was die-hard Nazis who were resisting us as we tried to capture a village. But when we got to the Danube, we built a floating bridge across the river, and then kept going. And then I looked at the map again, and there were only little villages between us and Munich. And I thought this will be a piece of cake, until one fine spring morning we drove into Dachau. And nobody had ever heard of Dachau, but within a day the name would be infamous all over the world for what the Nazis had been up to. And the first thing we saw was a railroad yard with boxcars with doors open and bodies piled up inside, and dumped out of the car, and literally littering the whole train yard. People, dead people in prison uniforms. And the next scene, a few yards beyond that, was what looked like factories, except they had bars on the windows, and people were pushing out windows and jumping out the windows to escape the barracks, and climbing over the fence or through the fence or under the fence and out the front gate. And as we came in, were running out and hugging us and surrounding us and begging us for something to eat and drink, because they were dehydrated, because the train thing, I believe, had held 6,000 prisoners who were locked in a boxcar and couldn't get out. It was, there were no toilet facilities, of course, in the boxcars, no light, no heat, and 5 or 6 days on the road, and no way to remove the dead bodies as the people died, and just a complete barbaric horror show. And but then we fed these prisoners. We gave them all the food we ourselves were carrying in our backpacks, and they hadn't eaten in so long that they couldn't hold the food down, and so they were throwing up. Some of them were having convulsions from eating the food that we thought we were helping them with. And so then the army told us not to feed anymore, and they would set up a line of tables on the street, and they would serve them foods that were easier to digest, like Jello and soups, light soups, and white bread, and so on. And they did that, and they also opened a tent hospital on the spot where they hospitalized the worst of them.
And before that, nobody knew about the concentration camps?
I'm going to get to that, because the next thing we did was force the people of the village out of their houses and force them to walk through the death camp in Dachau. And they did it, of course, reluctantly, and it was men, women, and children, and old people too, everybody. Nobody was exempted. If they could walk, we made them do it. And when they walked out, they were fainting and throwing up and collapsing, and everyone saying they didn't realize what was going on there. They knew that they had something of some sort of a prison, but they didn't realize how overcrowded it was and how brutal it was. And so but we in the Rainbow couldn't linger. They had later troops were coming to occupy, but we had to keep going because we were scheduled to go to Munich. And I don't think we slept in Dachau that night. We slept somewhere. We usually slept in cellars, but I slept in haystacks and under cars and just about anywhere I could sleep. But anyway, we kept going, and then when we got to Munich, it had surrendered, and we were going to have a victory parade, a victorious entry into a captured city. And I was so surprised because the army, for the first time in my experience, gave us a choice of locomotion. How do you want to walk to capture Munich? And you can ride in on a tank, or you can march in, or you can ride in on an open truck. And I opted to ride in on the open truck, and I stood the whole time and hung on. I was up in the front, and I was able to hang on to the cab. And I honestly remember saying to myself, if I live to be 100 years old, I will never have an experience like this in all my life. That capturing a surrendered city and moving in on a victory parade as the conquered troops are marched out, and Americans urging them along with guns on the ready and marching them out to a prison camp. And when we got to downtown Munich, they had also released a British prisoner of war camp that held soldiers who were captured after being shot down. And they had people from Dachau who had walked in their own victory parade to Munich. And everybody seemed to be carrying a bottle of vino and having a good time celebrating the whole thing.
So on an infamous family legend is the story of your birthday cake on your 21st birthday. As it's been told to us, you were on winter training in Virginia, was it?
Shenandoah National Park in the Blue Ridge Mountains.
Okay. And each time we hear this story, the snow gets deeper. But why don't you tell us about your mother? So your mother sent you a birthday cake, right? She shipped you a cake for your 21st birthday. And where were you when what were you doing that when you celebrated?
Well, part of the training in Fort Belvoir was you had to do 2 weeks of winter maneuvers in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and this was winter. It was winter, all right. And so we got up there. They drove us up there, and it had snowed, and we each had a pup tent, but the Army called them shelter halves, and they lined us up and said that by the fours, you get 4 of you guys put your pup tents. You could connect them, and make one big tent out of 4, and you brush away the snow and you sleep in the pup tent. And So we did that, and then the mail, they brought the mail up from Belleville was down on the Potomac River, so we were a long way from, but they did bring the mail up, and in the mail was a box holding my 21st birthday cake. And of course, you know, since everybody knows if you get a package in the Army and they say you get it, you have to split it with your friends. And I certainly had to split it with these other three guys who I knew. And we couldn't show a light in the pub tent. We had to be in total darkness on the maneuvers. And anyway, we opened the package and it was the pub tent. Excuse me. It was the cake my mother made. And so we cut the cake with bayonets and cut the cake in four, and we each had a quarter of a cake for my 21st birthday. And so, and my kids, every time I tell a story, my kids would say, Dad, every time you tell a story, the snow is a little deeper. But the snow was about 4 or 5 inches, and the temperature was about, I think it was 9 below zero, and the wind was blowing like crazy. So there's the story.
When you conquered Munich, you had a friend that you met many years later who was an artist, and you met him. Can you talk a little bit about your friend Paul DeTagius and your experience with him and what you learned about your shared history?
This was one I was going to say. After Munich, the garrison in Munich, that is, the soldiers who were stationed in Munich permanently had surrendered, but there were elements, there were some diehard units that would not surrender, and they went out of Munich and they went south. They were heading supposedly to the Alps, and they called themselves the werewolves. And their goal was to make it to the Alps and combine and revive the Nazi war and go out and sabotage the American occupation force. But they weren't all Nazis in this group, because I had a friend who was a Hungarian, and when the Nazis had marched into Hungary, all the young Hungarian men were drafted into the German army. So there were others besides pure Nazis in groups that elected to keep the war going. Well, that's the background on that. What happened was we were on a road, a little country road south of Munich, outside of it, I don't know, 10 miles or something. And I was in a column, and we had a tank leading the column and a tank coming up behind the column to give us a little more clout. And I heard, well, first I saw a tremendous flash in the back, and then I heard the noise, and the tank in the back had exploded, and the drivers and the people in the tank were trying to get out of the burning tank and screaming. And by the light of the burning tank, I could see there was a soldier in German uniform and holding a bazooka, and he had just shot the bazooka at the tank, and American soldiers were rushing to grab him, and they did grab him, and everyone was figuring lynch him or kill him, but they didn't. Somebody said no, because this outfit that he belonged to had not surrendered, and it was a war, and he was doing a soldier's duty, and they took him off. I don't know what happened to him. End of story. But many years later, as Nick is alluding, I had a friend, a Hungarian friend, who was teaching art in New Rochelle High School, and he needed flowers for his students to paint. And I owned a greenhouse at the time, and he became a steady customer. And so steady that I got to know him and talk to him, and I liked the guy. I almost thought he only buys a few at a time, and I like the guy, and I can supply the flowers for the class and not charge him, and I knew him well enough to propose that. And so he said, well, we'll keep track of it, but I never kept track of it. But anyhow, one day we were talking, and the subject got around to the army, and he said he had been forced into the German army. And he said, and I was in Munich when the war ended, and I said, so was I. And he said, I saw the most amazing thing. A guy in my outfit came out of the woods and aimed a bazooka at a tank and blew up the tank, and the Americans caught him, but they wouldn't hurt him. They took him as a prisoner of war. And I said, you know, Paul, I was there in the front of the column, and if we would have killed each other at the time, and we both hugged each other, and he was a very emotional guy. He was sobbing, and I was holding back the tears myself, because that's how it is, and he became a constant guest in our house. He painted. Nick, he was a very gifted painter. He died early. That's the end of the story. The next story, I'll do this quickly. The next story was a night or two later. We were again on a country road below Munich, and we saw this plane approaching us at very high speed. And as it got closer, we realized it didn't have any propellers. And as it got even closer, we could see it was something new. It was a jet plane. And the Germans had invented a jet plane. And we figured they're coming to strafe us. And so we all jumped into a muddy ditch alongside the road and hid, but he wasn't going to strafe us. He just flew over, and out of just to demonstrate, I think that they had such a plan. And this tipped off the Army intelligence that the Germans had jet planes, and they weren't flying them because they couldn't get the gasoline to fly them. And so the Army quickly went to the base and grabbed the 3 planes and put them in packing cases and sent them back to the United States so that the Russians wouldn't get at them and find out how the jet planes were made. End of story. The last story is we were in southern Germany, and 2 boxcars were discovered on a siding, and through the cracks in the walls of the boxcars, we could see the boxcars were filled with loot, silver and coins and artwork. And so we couldn't get into the boxcars because we were afraid that all this loot was booby-trapped, and we would be killing ourselves by moving anything. So we got the bomb squad to come and check, and it turned out there were no booby traps in it. And then they got the monument men to come, and they emptied the boxcars, and all the loot had been looted for Jewish families in Budapest and Vienna. And they were part of a long train of loot that the Nazis had been sending, trying to get out of Germany and into neutral Switzerland. And then they could go along and spend the money that they could make by selling the loot in Switzerland after the war. And that's the end of that story. We guarded the boxcars 24 hours a day.
So you had a role as well in the trials of some of those people who were trying to steal that. Can you talk about after you were transferred from the 42nd to the First Army?
So shortly after after that we kept going. This is a nice thing to talk about. We kept going, and we landed up in a wonderful city, Salzburg in Austria. And I knew it was Mozart's hometown, as it were. And they had the house, Mozart's house, which was a museum. And I went one night to see it, but it was closed. And the caretaker, the curator of the museum, looked out and he saw I was an American soldier. And of course, Austria was another one of those countries that had been overrun by the Nazis, and they were originally a free country and were a free country again. Anyway, he looked out the window and opened the door and asked me to come in and gave me a private tour. And I was allowed to sit at Mozart's piano. Nick had the piano lessons as a kid, but I never did. So all I did was hit a few keys to say I had played Mozart's piano. But that's besides the point. But after that, we went back to Germany, and the army had what they called a point system, where you got points that added up to a priority in getting shipped home again. And I had a priority that was higher than most people in the Rainbow, because I had been in the Mediterranean theater of war and had that too, and they didn't, because they had come to Europe a year after I had come to Africa. So anyway, I had the points, and I was transferred out of the Rainbow and into the Big Red One. And the Big Red One, that was the first division, was the oldest division in the Army, and the engineers was the oldest engineer regiment in the Army. And they had mostly West Point officers. It was a very gung-ho regiment. They had landed in Normandy, and they had a history of being the first division in the American Army, even in the Revolution. And to the first engineers had come the honor to renovate. I'll use the word renovate because we weren't really renovating. We were making it more miserable. But we were renovating the cells in the Nuremberg courthouse that held the Nazis, all of the Nazis, for the trial, for the judgment of Nuremberg trial. Only a few had escaped. Hitler had escaped by committing suicide in Berlin, and Goebbels had also committed suicide in the bunker in Berlin, taking with him his 5 children who he poisoned too. And so we had the remaining Nazis. And among them, we had some small fry, but we had the biggest Nazi of all, which was Goering. And our job in the prison was to remove anything that they might try to commit suicide on, because they wanted to keep them alive until the trial so that they could show the world what these guys had been up to, bringing war and troubles and persecution of so many people. And so the object was to keep them alive, but not to put them in heated, air-conditioned cells. So the cells were in an old building. It was, I think I remember it as bare stone. It was cold and clammy. There was one electric light hanging from a bulb, a dim bulb in the ceiling. The only window was a transom about 10 or 12 feet off the floor. They had a bed and a desk and a toilet, and that's about it. And so I had to go in all these cells, for the most part, empty when we did it. Each one would be empty of prisoners when we worked on them, and I had to pull coat hangers out of walls, which they were anchored between granite blocks of stone and cemented in, and very resistant to being removed. And surprisingly, we had to remove toilet seats, and I could never understand why, but we did as ordered. And the other thing would be to take out the glass in the transom windows, which required standing on top of a ladder and prying the glass out of the frame with a putty knife. And of course, the putty was old and like cement, and you had to be very careful getting it under the putty and lifting the putty off without connecting with a nail that would start a dart running across the glass, and the glass would shatter and fall on the floor. And with the fragments, even the slightest fragment, a prisoner could commit suicide by cutting his throat with this glass. And I thought, if it's glass that I got out wrong, I'll be shot at sunrise myself. So I was careful trying to get that. The glass took a long time to do it. And then we replaced that with a bubble paper of some sort. I don't know. But one day I was in the cell with Goering, and I had to do all this while the guard, all the cells had peepholes in the doors, and I had a guard standing night and day watching inside the cell. We weren't allowed to talk to the prisoners, and we sometimes they would, but not Goering. Sometimes the minor prisoners were allowed to walk in the hallway and talk to them. They all begged for cigarettes, which we never gave them. One cell that I had been working in before the prisoner arrived, not Goering's cell, but one of these cells, I thought I would like to put my personal touch on this, and it's not going to be Kilroy was here. And so I scratched a message on the wall of his cell, and it was from the book of Daniel, where in the book of Daniel, if you're not up to your Bible, the book of Daniel describes the handwriting on the wall. And the handwriting on the wall in the book of Daniel was one of the Jewish enemies had conquered Jerusalem, and they had vandalized the temple, and they stole all of the liturgical vases and plates and whatever else they were using, cups, anything they used in the liturgy, and they stole it. And the king, this pagan king, was going to have a big feast to celebrate the taking of Jerusalem. And the Lord was angry that they were using the hardware from the temple. And so, as the king was about to start his feast, a hand appeared on the wall of the king's palace, and it wrote Mene Mene Tekel, which is translated into God has numbered your kingdom and brought it to an end. And I wrote that on the cell to put in my own personal touch in the Nuremberg trial. And that's the end of that story. After that, the war was over, and we were given passes to thank us for our work at the prison. I got a week's furlough in Paris. And I had heard with this point system, also you went home by how high your points were. And I had high points, but there was a shortage of ships to take us home. And I had heard that if you got a job, and only if you got a job in Europe would it be allowed that you would be discharged in Europe. And so I decided on my own that I was going to get a job in Europe, and I could go home on my own. And better still, some ships were employing people to shovel coal, and I could get home on a ship. If I would shovel coal, I would be paid $40 a week besides, and I would be home before the Army would get around to sending me home. So I went to, they had a War Shipping Administration Bureau in London, and the pass, when I was in London on the pass, I went to this thing, I applied for a job. They said I needed a physical, and I took the physical and passed. And they said, yes, they would employ me. The Army would take me to Antwerp, and I would get on an American ship and go back and work my way home. I took the application, it was all stamped and formalities done. Took it back to my camp in Germany, gave it to my captain. And the guy had never been particularly friendly. And he leaned back in his chair and he said, you know, Pouder, you're crazy. You don't have to shovel coal to get home. You can wait a week and you go home, because I can tell you your ship is waiting in Le Havre and you're on it and you can go home next week. And so I said, okay, I'll do it that way. And that's what happened. I can bring the whole story to a halt in a minute.
Okay.
Anyway, I went home on an Army ship. It took 10 days. I landed at the same dock that I had sailed for. I spent New Year's night, that was New Year's between 1945 and 1946 in a troop train going north to Fort Dix. It was exactly a year since I had had guard duty in France on New Year's Eve, 1944, 45. On which night, if anybody told me in a year you're going to be on a troop train going to Fort Dix to be discharged, I'd say, you're absolutely crazy. So up to Dix, and 5 days later, I went home. And I began my life again. And I guess that's the end of the story.